You're looking at Tomorrowland. George Clooney gets top billing, though this really is her movie here. I believe her name is Brit something. It's her movie, but she gets third billing, mainly because George Clooney is George Clooney. And the second billing, I believe, was Hugh Laurie, because his name is Hugh Laurie. And George Clooney's in it for the second half of the film, but she's in it for pretty much all of it, except for the opening segment, which is played by a child version of the character that George Clooney plays. But that's not important. Why are you looking at this film on this screen right now? Well, it's because it represents an idea. An idea that Walt Disney once had back in the late 50s, I believe. If you want to look this up, I believe it was the Epcot project or something. The Tomorrowland, a society of dreamers and thinkers who were building the world of tomorrow today, and that no matter how far in the future you got, this Tomorrowland would always look like tomorrow. The project was scrapped, though we still have the Epcot Center and all that other stuff at Disneyland and all that stuff. So if you want to go there and enjoy that, feel free to be my guest. But this film is loosely based off of that idea, and they created something from it that feels like a mixture of BioShock meets Fringe meets a bunch of other stuff. It's just a menagerie of ideas, though primarily I thought of BioShock and Fringe. So, the idea was, in the early 60s, they recruited a bunch of dreamers and thinkers and got them into this Tomorrowland society, this city that was built. It's very futuristic looking. It was built in some sort of alternate here. It's a here that's not here. Which brings me into my Fringe idea. The television show Fringe is based on parallel worlds. I don't know how many parallel worlds the TV show explained. I only watched up to season 2. But from season 2 they explained that there is a parallel here that is happening now. It's just not happening here. It's a here that's another here on another plane of existence. That's kind of the idea I got from Tomorrowland. Tomorrowland is a here that is not here. It's in a different location, and they have to cross the dimensional boundaries through the miracle of science and all that stuff. That you gotta suspend some of the science, because, you know, it hasn't happened yet. It could happen. I like to be optimistic about a lot of this science stuff. There's some things that people would say is impossible through the laws of physics, to which I would always argue that there is nothing that is impossible, provided that you can think of it. If you can think of it, it probably exists. Maybe only within your mind. But it exists. All the same. Well, we're getting into philosophy there, but this film gets into philosophy as well. It gets into a lot of things like determinism. The philosophy of determinism takes a big role in this. George Clooney's character plays a young innovator who joined the Tomorrowland Society back in the 60s as a child. He was a brilliant child. You know, he built a jetpack when he was just a kid, and the jetpack flew him into the Tomorrowland after the recruiter. She plays a recruiter. She's like an android that looks like a child, because the child is the representation of innocence, you know. That innocence, that childlike innocence, that unique way of looking at the world that seems to die when you get older. And so they make these androids that look like children to recruit other people who haven't given up. How do we explain haven't given up? Well, like somebody who looks at the world and doesn't just say, oh, the world's going to garbage, but I'm just gonna do my own thing. I'm gonna wake up every morning. I just gotta go do my thing, get my pay, go home, wake up the next day, do my thing, get my pay, go home, and maybe a couple months later you'll take a vacation or something, and then you come back, and then you do it again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. The next year comes by, and you're doing it again, again, and 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 again. And then the next thing you know, you're in a box. They're not looking for people like that. They're looking for people who are thinking outside of that trappings that seems to happen to people who grow up from being the dreamer youth into the trapped adult who's just trapped in a life, just trapped, you know? They're looking for people who grow up from that aspiring youth into the aspiring adult who hasn't given up on seeing the world in a different point of view, if that makes sense. They see things differently. They're dreamers, idealists. And what is an idealist other than somebody who has an idea and thinks it's possible? It just hasn't happened yet, but if it hasn't happened and they think it's possible, then they want to talk about how they can make it happen. But if everybody keeps throwing the idealist out, then the recruiter goes to pick up the idealist and they take them to Tomorrowland, where the idealist's ideas can make Tomorrowland better. And so it's kind of like a brain drain. They're taking all the great thinkers and all the great minds throughout the world from the 60s onwards, and they put them into the Tomorrowland, where this society has boomed to become one of the greatest utopian cities you could ever imagine, until George Clooney's character comes up with an idea that could basically predict the future, so to speak. As he explains to this character here, Britt, he says, what if you could know exactly when you would die? Would you want to know the answer to that question? Which brings determinism, the philosophy of determinism, into play. If you know something's going to happen, would you be able to change it now that you know it's going to happen? And I would argue that you could. I personally disagree with determinism in the regards to if the future could be found out, then you would have already changed it by finding out the future, if that makes sense. Or if determinism is true, then the future that you found out isn't exactly the future, because the future that you changed is actually the determined future, because you already looked through an old future that wasn't actually real, and so you have already changed it, which is that you were determined to change it because you already were determined to find the future. It's very, very, very... This is the world of philosophy, friends. This is the world of philosophy. Just keep going down the rabbit hole and you'll never come out. You'll never come out. You'll never come out. So he finds he creates the little mystical MacGuffin device that can determine the world's future, the planet's future. Through the use of, as the movie calls it, tachyons or whatever, you can determine the past. You can look into the past and see moments in the past using the tachyons or whatever. It's like an observation sphere, like the Cerebro. It's kind of like a big sphere that you're standing in, and you're holding a little ball in your hands, and you could see the past, and through that perspective you could also see the future. So George Clooney decides to look into the future, and he learns that Earth has an expiration date. Humanity has an expiration date. And once he learns about this expiration date of humanity, he begins to despair. And so does Hugh Laurie's character, who is the ruler of the Tomorrowland. Hugh Laurie's character begins to despair. And so this despair, this knowledge that your world is going to end, spreads out into everybody, right? It goes out into everybody. So the first thing that Hugh Laurie's character might think to do is to tell the politicians and the leaders of the world, hey, your planet is heading towards the brink of destruction. Perhaps you might want to change its course. It's possible to still change it, but perhaps you might want to do that. And Hugh Laurie finds that nobody is willing to change the destruction. It's almost as if they want it. It's almost as if they're gliding towards it willingly, the destruction of the world and all that stuff. They're willingly burning. It gets very environmentalist. This film gets very environmentalist, and I don't want to tell you my personal feelings on environmentalist and all that stuff, but it gets very environmentalist about how you want to save the planet by not blowing it up. And logically, I am inclined to agree with that. As a person that likes being alive, I would like to have a planet to be alive on. And if I want to continue living, I would have to continue making the planet livable to be on, you know? So that's just my logical point of view. And so that's what Hugh Laurie's point of view ends up becoming. He wants to be alive. The world's not going to end in Tomorrowland, so he's going to lock Tomorrowland off from the world. The world is heading towards destruction, and apparently nobody wants to do anything about it. Nobody wants to do anything about the environment. Nobody wants to do anything about the politics. Nobody wants to do anything about the wars. Nobody wants to do anything about anything. It's like they're spearheading themselves directly towards that end expiration date willingly, because they don't want to change it. That's what Hugh Laurie ends up having this huge speech near the end of the film about how everybody has accepted a sort of state of doom. There's they just go full doomer towards the end. They just accept it. And this brings me back to another film I watched a couple of weeks ago called After Period Life. It's on this channel if you want to look for it, which comes to a rant that Liam Neeson's character talked about. That how he looks out into the world, out into society, and he sees a society full of corpses. He sees people who are dead. They aren't exactly living. The body is technically biologically alive, maybe, but the people are dead. They basically are just robots waking up, doing the same thing every day. They're not really living. He sees a society of dead people who are basically wasting the life that has been given to them. So Liam Neeson thinks that it is his job to put the dead people into the ground, even though they're technically biologically alive. And that brings the nihilism into this as well. Hugh Laurie begins to embrace the whole approach that deterministic, you can't avoid the end, so we're just gonna close off Tomorrowland and live in Tomorrowland as the world blows up. And you learn it will blow up in 58 days. And George Clooney meets this girl, Britt, and she is an idealist. She hasn't given up. He has, because, you know, he's grown up, he's basically lost his faith. And it gets resparked, that childhood idealism gets resparked through the actions of this character. So they both go to Tomorrowland to stop the end of the world. And you eventually learn that the world is only going to end so long as people know it's going to end at that point. It's kind of like a... what's that word I'm looking for? Something that happens only because you know it's going to happen. It wouldn't have happened if you didn't know it was going to happen, if that makes sense. It's like determinism through knowledge of it being deterministic. That something happens only because you are aware that it's going to, and so you head towards that subconsciously, if that makes sense. If that makes sense. It's you know. So they think if they shut this machine that determined the world's fate being destroyed in 58 days, if they shut this machine down, they think that it'll stop the world from being destroyed, right? So, and it ends up working, They destroy the machine, and apparently that ends up saving the planet. Because it's like a self... What's this word? I'm looking for this word. Okay, I think I found it here. It might be the self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a psychological phenomenon where you would predict or expect something, and it's this prediction or expectation of the thing that ends up resulting in behaviors that align with the prediction. That's what a self-fulfilling prophecy is, according to the dictionary. I learned about this with the whole philosophy and psychology stuff. So That's what a self-fulfilling prophecy is. You learn about an event, and your behaviors end up aligning towards that event. It's subconscious, they just align towards it. So by getting rid of the deterministic prediction, by removing the prediction, by not knowing what's going to happen, you can veer off to a different direction, if that makes sense. So that's what they do. And then they reignite Tomorrowland, and they start bringing more dreamers in, and everybody's happy, hunky-dory. This is a very adequate film. It reminds me a lot of National Treasure in regards to the whole wonderment. This is a National Treasure type of film. It's got a lot of conspiracy theories and all this stuff surrounding the Tomorrowland project with the Epcot and all that stuff. But they really go full ham on it. It's not just like Freemasons making an underground treasure hoard and stuff like that. It's more like Walt Disney and all the super smart people created a society of super smart thinker people. And they made it in a separate dimension, and it's all sci-fi spaceships and all that stuff. And they figured this out by the 50s. They figured all this out by the 50s, and they didn't share any of this with anybody else. And I agree with it. I really do. I really agree with the way they did this. All the super future tech that they don't share with the rest of the world. Think of it like this. Imagine, I'm gonna pull out my little trademark notepad here. It's gonna probably expend the runtime by another 5 minutes, who cares? So let's say we have Person Man here. Person Man here is a very, very high-tech smart man. We're gonna put a little big hat on him. He's a big smart man with a big wizard's robe. He's got a wizard stick. He's very smart. He's got future technology. He's got big weapons and all that stuff. What would happen if Mr. Smart Man comes over to, let's try to make a little hunched over face here, hunched back, hands like that, feet like this. Let's say this is a primate primitive, right? So Future Man comes to visit Mr. Primitive here. Future Man gives Mr. Primitive his magic stick. The big magic stick that can, like, blow things up, right? And Future Man says, well, don't blow things up with this thing. It's a really cool device, though. And Future Man then runs off. Future Man goes away. So then, the Primitive Man, not being as primitive as he is, says he's going to take this big stick and he's going to point it at another Primitive Man. We're going to put this one here. We're going to give him a hunched back like this, with the hand sticking out like that. So we're gonna have this guy point the stick at this guy, and this guy gets blown up, right? He just points it at him and blows him up. And the Primitive ends up going on a rampage, destroying buildings, destroying all these things, abusing the technology, right? And then Future Man comes in and says, why did you do all this stuff? It's like you don't even know the purpose of the thing that I gave you. And then he stops and realizes what he said. That's why the future tech of Tomorrowland has not been shown to the rest of the world. It's because they're not exactly ready yet. But the idea of Tomorrowland is to make tomorrow today by utilizing the people who haven't given up and getting enough of them in a society like this to create the ideal society. And one day, the Primitive Man will eventually evolve into getting a big hat of his own, and that's when the Future Man could come to the Primitive Man and say, hey, I've got all this cool stuff. You want to see what I got? And then the Primitive Man finally becomes a Future Man of himself. And that's my theory on why they hide the technology from you. It's because they don't think you're ready. They don't think you're ready. They think you're not advanced enough mentally, faculty, and all that stuff. They think you're not there yet. And they think if we give you all these toys, you're going to end up abusing them. You're going to get greedy. You're going to get corrupt. And you're going to start blowing things up. And everybody's going to bicker. And everybody's going to fight. And everything. But yeah! You don't want that. You don't want that. So, the Tomorrowland and the deterministic, self-fulfilling prophecy movie. I unpacked a lot from this film, and I would recommend that you see it. It barely made its budget back, but it's worth watching. I highly recommend it. It's imaginative, and the whole idea of Tomorrowland is based on imagination, idealism. It's based on the facets that I really love, man, and that's why I would recommend you take a look. Take a look at Tomorrowland. It's imaginative.